I think the right way of situating this discussion and bringing in the sovereign wealth funds is the theme of globalization. Globalization meaning the increasing integration of goods, services, and capital in the global economy. And the sovereign wealth funds is simply a manifestation of the increased globalization that we had seen particularly in the last 25 years. I think if we were to try to quantify it in terms of global trade as a proportion of world GDP, I think clearly we've seen a fantastic increase. I think a quintupling of global trade as a proportion of world GDP. I think it now stands at about 25% of world GDP. I mean, China is probably now the most globally interconnected economy in the world in terms of its, trade, the number of countries that it trades with, and that's a very significant development. And if you look at what's happening globally, if you take the G12 countries, G12 here I would include Australia, and compare it against the G7, the developed countries, well, we had a crossing point in 2008 where the G12 accounted for 40% of global GDP, same as the developed world. So there was a crossing point there which speaks about how the emerging economies have prospered because of globalization. Now, the sovereign wealth funds, which is my topic today, is really an offspring of globalization. And first of all, we need to be very clear what we are talking about. The sovereign wealth funds, we are talking about a group of asset owners or asset controllers which are largely government-owned or government-controlled. Now, this has happened because with globalization, countries such as China, but by no means China, you include countries such as Brazil, Korea, and we to a smaller extent in Singapore. Because of globalization, we have been the beneficiaries of that. Our economies have grown more strongly. Being high savings economies, we have accumulated more surpluses, and those surpluses find their way to be managed by sovereign wealth funds. So this is a group of countries who now control a substantial amount of wealth. In other words, there has been a major redistribution of wealth globally, moving in the direction of the sovereign wealth funds in the emerging economies. And of course, the thing that creates concern is the fact that these pools of money, I think Joel mentioned a figure of 12 trillion. I would think that's probably correct. About 12 trillion, probably among about 40 countries. And these pools of money are, so-called government controlled, as opposed to private sector managed. So it creates all kinds of concerns as to the political motivation behind the management of these reserves. In some cases, it raises security concerns. So let me try to offer you some thoughts as to how Singapore in particular, as a sovereign wealth fund, how we've been a beneficiary of globalization. As you all know, the Singapore economy is a highly open economy. We live or die by what happens in the global economy. And so, in our case, in order for us to grow in our economy, we depend on stable conditions in the world. We need to import talent and labor the movement of human capital, intellectual capital, to grow our economy. So we have been able to benefit from this global inflow into Singapore, not so much of financial capital, but more of human capital and intellectual capital. We've been able to grow our economy at a relatively good rate, and because we are a high savings economy with a great emphasis on self-reliance, we've been able to build up quite a substantial amount of foreign reserves, which I have the privilege of leading a team of people to manage. 45% of our investments are in public equities globally, with 30% in developed markets, 15% in emerging markets, which is very significant because in the emerging markets, if you grow by, if you take equities as a whole, the emerging market content is about 12%. But in our case, of the 45 in public equities, we have 15, one-third. And that suggests to you that in the way we allocate capital, we are looking for growth. And in the last 12 years since we embarked on this policy, moving money from the developed equity markets into the emerging markets, that has been a significant source of value add relative to the benchmark.